sometimes there's a message from the webinar saying it's starting to record, but apparently it didn't. So anyway, thank you, Paul. Thank you all for joining us. I see some familiar names there. So hello to those of you who we have met or worked with together virtually or in person. As Paul stated, I'm interested in keeping IRBs focused on their core mission to the extent that that's possible. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the mission creep in IRBs and the various demands that are placed on it. So I want to just provide a framework based on the regulations, and we can dive into some interesting problems as we go along. So I promise that the only untrue thing that I'm going to say today is, actually I'm not saying it, I'm showing it, this picture of me, which is about 10 years old. Paul can attest that I might look a little bit older than that right now, but otherwise, let's get started. So let's see if I can actually get the page to advance. There we go. So my objectives here is to understand the proper roles and scope of authority of the IRB. And that's really the bottom line here, scope of authority of the IRB, at least looking at it in terms of the regulations and what the regulations authorize. So we'll get into that here shortly. I have a point here, this kind of little pet peeve of mine about confidentiality and its role in our reviews. It's obviously a very important thing to maintain confidentiality, but I think it is misunderstood by many in the research community about what its place is in the regulatory framework and the ethical framework. So we're gonna have a little conversation about that. The role of scientific design in IRB review. This is something that is a little bit complicated, and I think sometimes IRBs get led astray on this question. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that. The role of social impact in IRB review. I think this is less a problem with most IRBs, but it does happen, particularly when you have members who may not be familiar with the regs, and the regs are very specific about this, so I think it's important to highlight that. And provide an ethical argument based on the regs of why informed consent is not an absolute. I hear frequently from investigators, faculty, colleagues, etc., that there's a belief out there that you always have to have informed consent. Those of you familiar with the regs know that that is not true. We're going to look a little bit at the ethics of that. I hope to get that far into the presentation. Last time I did this, I didn't quite make it, so hopefully we'll get there. All right, so first, starting from sort of scratch, what's the purpose of the IRB? There are some myths out there. I'm sure you have heard these. If you've been serving on IRBs for any length of time, you have heard these complaints. Our purpose is not to harass investigators. I know that that is a view, a common view of IRBs, but that's not our purpose. It's not to rewrite the research of the investigators. We may get involved in a little bit of that, but that's really not what our goal is. Our purpose is not to prevent research from happening. In fact, quite the contrary. Our purpose is to try to promote research and make it happen, just make it happen in an ethical way, in a compliant way. The purpose is not to provide permission to publish research findings. This is one of the most common misunderstandings about IRBs, is the belief that if you're going to publish something, therefore that occasions IRB review. And if you're not planning on publishing, therefore you don't have to go to the IRB. Nothing could be further from the truth, actually. And it's a dangerous misconception, so we'll talk briefly about that. And the purpose is not to validate the importance of the investigator's research. I've actually had faculty member come to me and want IRB review, even though what they were doing wouldn't meet the definition of research involving human subjects, because they thought it would make their research look more important. And I was somewhat aghast at that claim because it's like, why would you want to go through this process if you didn't have to? We have one purpose, and that's to protect human subjects. And I think if we always keep that in focus, that's 90% of the game. It's just, that's our job, is to protect human subjects. We should always ask ourselves, is what we're doing going to contribute to the protection of human subjects or not? And there's some things that we have to do that don't protect human subjects, but we have to do them because the regs say we have to do them. But for the most part, that is the name of the game here. All right. Why do we exist? I suspect, knowing some of you on the webinar today, and I suspect others, if you're interested in this topic, you probably know why we exist. The abuse of researcher privilege that has gone on for at least, since the early part of the 20th century, if not earlier than that. You all, I think, are familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study. If you are not, it is probably the most important case to read in medical ethics. And what's really interesting, I thought about doing a webinar about this sometime. You can take the Tuskegee syphilis study and you can basically find, 70% of the requirements for consent and regulatory review in the Tuskegee syphilis study. That is what they did wrong, and so it's a excellent case, and it is the founding case for IRBs, as some of you may know. It's what occasioned the National Commission's work that led to the development of the regulations. The Milgram experiment, if you've never heard of Stanley Milgram, he's a researcher at Yale, did some really interesting psychology experiments, and he is the reason why we have the concept of debriefing in the waiver of informed consent. So if you're not familiar with Stanley Milgram, Google him. Really interesting experiments, somewhat ethically problematic, but very interesting stuff. Willowbrook and a number of others. If you haven't seen Beecher's article of 1966, he cataloged 40 or 50 research studies that he found that he thought had some ethical deficiencies. And he wanted to publish about 80 or 90, but they wouldn't let him just for the, just the publication was too long. But really interesting stuff that has gone on. Of course, you're familiar probably with other cases. So we're here to prevent those bad things from happening, right? That's the way we protect human subjects, at least primarily. Because those bad things can happen, IRBs have been given an inordinate amount of authority. It is the only committee within an institution whose decisions to not approve something, in our case protocols, cannot be appealed or overruled. This is really strange. I don't know of any other case in any institution, educational, hospital, corporate, etc., where a committee's authority is unappealable. Every committee in an academic institution, their decisions can always be overruled by some administrator or ultimately the president or the board of trustees. The hospital CEO can overrule all sorts of decisions within the hospital, but by federal mandate, the IRB's decision not to approve may not be appealed. It is final. So that engenders a scary amount of authority on the part of the IRB, and investigators know and understand that, if only intuitively, and that's the reason why investigators are generally scared of the IRB and why they will often do whatever we ask. They may not do it well or do it properly, but they're fairly subservient to IRBs. It's rare that you get investigators really pushing back, although sometimes you do. But we have to be my point here is that we have to be very careful about this authority that we exercise. This is the statement in the regulations. Research covered by this policy that has been approved by an IRB may be subject to further appropriate review and approval or disapproval by officials of the institution. So if we approve something, the institution can say, no, we're not going to do that. And I've seen that happen, actually. Not for very good reasons, but I've seen it happen. However, those officials may not approve the research if it has not been approved by an IRB. That's the unappealable authority of the IRB. And so that's written very clearly in the regulations. If you have an FWA, that's what you sign up for. That's what your institution has signed up for. So that's an awesome power. And so we have to be careful about how we exercise that power. Very few of us actually deny approval of research. It does happen. Mostly what we do is just infinite rewrites, right? Just keep revising it until you get it right, or you just go away in frustration. But On those occasions where we just say this is just not an appropriate risk to take, etc., there's not much the investigator can do about that. So it should be used sparingly, but the authority, it's the authority more than the use of it that I think is the problem and gives rise to a certain amount of mission creep. So let's use that power judiciously and wisely. All right, so my general rules for IRBs is that we should exercise the least amount of oversight power and review of research as is consistent with the protection of human subjects in that research and is consistent with the federal regulations. I recognize that this is an ideal. It is not done in practice. We, in many occasions, go beyond the regulations for various reasons, but I think it's an ideal, keeping in mind that we have that authority to disapprove and what that authority is unappealable. We should be very self-conscious about extending our authority beyond what the regulations say. And probably when we do extend our authority beyond what the regulations say, we should not hold that absolute power of denial, use that to hold protocols hostage when we go beyond the regulations. IRB should facilitate the research they review as much as possible. Research is good, and IRBs support research. That's, our first job is to protect human subjects. I think our second job is to make sure that good research happens to the extent that we can facilitate that. If you're not in favor of research, then you probably shouldn't be on an IRB, because that's kind of the name of the game here. We want to make sure that research goes forward. We don't want to stand in the way. IRBs are supposed to be collegial ethical peer review committees. That's how they were conceived back in the day by the National Commission. They were never intended to be a sort of extreme compliance regime. The FDA has, in particular, and in some cases with good reason, has turned IRBs into a much more compliance-oriented operation. And that's important for a variety of reasons, even without the FDA involvement. We have to make sure that we are documenting things properly and sort of operating in good standing. On the other hand, I think some of our concerns are perhaps overblown insofar as we don't treat our researchers as colleagues, but as supplicants. And I think the idea of collegial peer review is a good one, even if we can't always attain it. That was how IRBs were originally conceived to operate. That's how they operated at the NIH before IRBs became part of the regulatory regime that we have. So, little perspective. In general, there are two kinds of IRBs. There are biomedical, clinical IRBs. Typically, they see high risk, high benefit research. On the other hand, this requires clinical judgment. Obviously, to weigh the risks and benefits of new drugs, devices, etc., procedures, you need people with the medical knowledge to make those kinds of clinical judgments. Social science IRBs, on the other hand, typically see low risk, low benefit, that is benefit to subjects, not necessarily to society, but research that doesn't impact the subjects extensively. Although in cases of psychological counseling, they may be of great benefit to the subjects. These two poles, obviously, there's many things that cross the lines. There's minimal risk clinical research, there's supplements research, that sort of stuff. There's also social science research that can be quite risky. People are involved in working with people with suicidal tendencies. In social science research, obviously, you have much greater risk. So there's a whole range, but these two poles, I think, are useful because most of us fall into one or the other of these categories. The most enlightening thing I've done, and the thing that I enjoy the most, is sitting on a biomedical IRB. I sit on Bridgeport Hospital's IRB in Connecticut. I been on that IRB since 1995. And what's interesting about that is, when you see protocols that have real risk, have high risk, have high benefits, your perspective on risk changes. I think there's a tendency amongst social science IRBs to get to overblow or to inflate the risks in the social science research that they're reviewing, because and typically that's a risk of confidentiality, breach of confidentiality, and see those risks as perhaps greater than they are. Whereas when you've had a chance to look at a couple of dozen or a couple of hundred biomedical, clinical trials, that sort of thing, it gives you a sort of perspective on risk that I think is useful to have. I would always recommend members of social science IRBs to have a chance to sit in on a couple of IRB meetings for a hospital IRB. Just a little bit about risk and benefit, just being the bioethicist that I am. The Belmont report, which I assume you all are familiar with, has a great discussion defining risks and benefits. Risk is defined as both the magnitude of harm and the probability of harm. So you have two dimensions there. And obviously benefits, likewise, you have magnitude of benefit and probability of benefit. And so that makes risk-benefit judgments rather complicated, because you've got sort of four poles. You've got things that can be really bad that are going to happen very rarely, and you have things that might be moderately good happening all the time, et cetera. So it gets, this is where, judgment really comes in. And as the Belmont report says, risk-benefit assessments are concerned with the probabilities and magnitudes, possible harms and benefits. Just to give you a sort of graphical representation, things can go from low probability, low magnitude benefit or harm to high probability, high magnitude benefit or harm. Obviously, we want to avoid the red square when it's risks. And we want to, get into the red square when it's benefits. That's the that's the goal. Whether we obviously we can't meet that all the time, but that's the goal. Now, this is relative, of course, obviously table of harms. That's relative to the benefits. All right, so a little bit, enough about risk and benefit. I did that because I want to talk a little bit about minimal risk and draw some conclusions based on the definition of minimal risk in the regulations. So I'm sure you're familiar with this definition. Minimal risk means the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. Now, certainly a routine physical exam does not present physical risk. But as I'm sure you're all familiar with, being human beings, having been to the doctor before, certainly the risks of confidentiality are more than minimal when you're engaged with your doctor, because you're talking about private information that you don't share with other people typically, that you don't want disclosed. And yet here the regulations are saying doing something like a physical exam is minimal risk, in spite of the fact that there are confidentiality risks. And that's really what I'm after here. I'm going to make a little bit of a claim here that you may disagree with. That confidentiality is not a research risk or a risk that rises above minimal if adequate measures are taken to protect privacy. So confidentiality, the data that's collected in research, is not something that we do to subjects. It's something that we get from subjects in research. And so it's not per se a research risk in the same way that giving somebody an injection would be, or doing a blood draw, or giving them a drug, a new drug, et cetera, where there's direct risk to them. Confidentiality is a risk that we have to manage, but it's not per se a research risk. And to justify this claim, I'm going to take you to a passage from the Federal Register. This is in guidance from OHRP many years ago, and it's still in effect. Basically, what they're talking about, the expedited review procedure and when it can be used or not used. And what they say is that The expedited procedure may not be used where identification of the subjects and/or their responses would reasonably place them at risk of criminal or civil liability, be damaging to their subjects' financial standing, employability, insurability, reputation, be stigmatizing, right? So you've got risky data. So they're saying expedited review cannot be used if you have risky data, right? And that could be everything from your HIV status to your criminal activities, to anything else that might be compromising to you. But notice the word unless here, unless. So we may not use the expedited review procedure if we have risky data, unless reasonable and appropriate protections will be implemented so that risks related to invasion of privacy and breach of confidentiality are no greater than minimal, right? And we all sort of know this intuitively, because in every protocol that we review, we pay attention to the procedures for the protection of privacy and confidentiality. And so as long as those procedures are in place, the research is minimal risk. And that's the reason why I make the claim that confidentiality is not a research, or breach of confidentiality is not a research risk. Rather, it is a risk that's inherent in most research, almost all research, that we must manage. And as long as we manage it properly, then the research, no matter what it is, can be considered minimal risk. I'm sorry, the research, if it is otherwise minimal risk, can be considered minimal risk even if you have risky data. So the fact that someone has risky data in their protocol does not by itself mean that it's beyond minimal risk. They just have to make sure to have the proper procedures in place to protect that data. All right, so we're going to move to scientific review. What is the IRB's responsibility with regard to the scientific validity of the study? IRBs are often composed, at least in part, of scientists, physicians, people who like science, who do science. And as scientists, their primary concern is often the science. It's natural for scientists to look at the science in any study that they're reading and want to comment on it. Or perhaps offer suggestions or make requirements to change the scientific structure of the protocol to make it better science. And the impetus, I think, is good, but we have to be very careful about what the IRB does under the guise of its authority when it's requiring changes to scientific design. The regulations are silent on the IRB's responsibility to review the scientific design. However, the regulations do say that the IRB must determine that the risks to subjects are reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits, if any, to the subjects. And this is the key part, the importance of the knowledge that may reasonably be expected to result. Right, so again, what the regulations are saying is we should balance the risk to subjects against the importance of the knowledge, which I would take to include the validity of the knowledge. Because if the knowledge is not produced in a valid manner, it's not going to be important. So the bottom line here is, if we are going to put subjects at risk, we should do so for the sake of good knowledge. We should have good scientific design. So as risks increase, so does the scrutiny of the scientific merits. The sledgehammer of unappealable IRB denial of approval should not be used to force investigators to change protocols that present little or no risk. Now, I know this is controversial because I know a number of IRBs that insist on making changes to the scientific design in minimal risk studies. My suggestion would be that if the IRB is going to take that responsibility should be vested in it properly by the institution itself. If you're a college or university, we're stepping on academic freedom issues here. And so if the IRB is going to take it upon itself to review and make changes to scientific design, It should do so because the institution, through its normal governance procedures, charged it with that job. I don't know many cases in institutions where they have been specifically charged with the job of reviewing scientific design. They simply take it upon themselves to do so because that's what they've always done, because they've always been scientists on the board, and that's what they do. And I think that that should be normalized and made explicit for everyone. It may be a good thing to improve the scientific design of studies, but to use this super authority that the IRB is granted by the regulations for that purpose, I think is wrong, except when there are risks to the subjects. If we're doing a clinical trial and we don't have good science, we're not only wasting the subject's time and the scientist's time, but we're putting them at risk of harm, right, without getting any corresponding benefit in terms of the knowledge, right? And that's what the regulations say, is that we should balance those risks of harm to the subjects against both the possible benefits to the subjects and the importance of the knowledge. So I think it makes perfect sense to pay attention to scientific design in the the medium to higher risk population. In minimal risk studies, I'm much less sanguine about that practice, although I know it goes on. I think the IRB can certainly provide guidance, or not guidance, but suggestions, kind of friendly, hey, if you want to make this a better study, you might do this, right? But we shouldn't use our authority unless we're specifically charged by our institutions to do that. So that may be controversial. I'd be curious to hear your questions about that. So. All right, social benefit. This is another one. This is less of a problem, at least in my experience. I do know some IRBs that sort of cross this line, although they, in some cases, have good reason. In evaluating risks and benefits, the IRB should consider only those risks and benefits that may result from the research. And this is the regulatory language. The IRB should not consider possible long-range effects of applying knowledge gained in the research. For example, the possible effects of the research on public policy as among those research risks that fall within the purview of its responsibility. Now, in most cases, there aren't, much of the research we see does not have any direct impact or even likely impact upon policy. But it's certainly possible to have research that does. If you're doing research, say that on abortion, the institution may have something to say about that, depending on the kind of institution you work in. But the IRB's job is not to say, well, if this research comes out this way, that would affect this policy, and that might be a bad thing. The IRBs are not supposed to impose their moral or political judgments on the possible effects or impact of the research. That can create some difficult situations. You can imagine some of the studies that have been done in the past on intelligence and race, or intelligence or character, or all sorts of things involving race, gender, ethnicity, etc. Right? Those studies might fall into this category. And so we need to be very careful that we're not making judgments about the nature of the knowledge to be produced. We are specifically forbidden from doing so. That doesn't mean that the institution doesn't have say. I work with several IRBs that explicitly say we're not going to do certain kinds of research because they're contrary to the mission of the institution. You can imagine a Catholic hospital, right? There's certain, reproductive research, abortion, IVF, that sort of stuff. They're simply not going to do that research, and that's fine. They can just, that's their policy. They don't have to do anything that any investigator comes up with. I worked with a number of American Indian tribes that actually do prior review of results of publications because they, as a tribe, have authority over that data and how those conclusions are disseminated and what might be said. So there are cases where this happens, but the IRB should not be the locus of exercising that authority. We are specifically forbidden from doing so. So again, that nasty sledgehammer that we have has to be wielded very judiciously and not for political, social reasons, much as it might be distasteful to us in certain circumstances. All right, so now to some bread and butter things. What do we actually do? We evaluate research involving human subjects. So we're going to talk a little bit about the definition of research and the definition of human subjects. Some of the most interesting questions arise, particularly around the concept of research. Excuse me. So what is research? This is from the Belmont report. This is from whence we derive the famous generalizable knowledge statement that gets inserted into the regulations. Research means a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation, excuse me, designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And we all struggle with that term generalizable. You may have your own ideas about what generalizable means. One thing it does not mean is publication. It's certainly true that we disseminate, we generalize our results through publication, but publication is not the same as generalizable knowledge. If you look in the regs, you do a word search for publication. The only reference to publication in the regulations is publication of the regulations in the Federal Register. Whether you're publishing a study or not has nothing to do with whether the IRB should review it. And this is I've heard longtime IRB people make this claim. I've heard otherwise very smart doctors, lawyers, you name it, make this claim. It is simply false. And it's also a dangerous falsehood because here's a scenario for you. If I don't plan to publish results of a study, I can still put people at serious risk, right? Our job is to protect the human subjects, right? Whether or not the knowledge is going to be gained is going to be published. I believe that a fair amount of IVF research went on without publication. I think you could make an argument at the beginning, at least, that put future babies at possible risk, may have put mothers at risk. So the fact that things aren't published is not the issue. The question is, are the procedures placing somebody at risk? So here's some examples of things. I'm just curious, I'll just go through these. Applying rubrics to random samples of student work within an academic department. For those of you not familiar with this, this is what is assessment of student learning, where you have a scale that you evaluate student writing on. And that scale it may be complex. These rubrics have, they're kind of like multiple choice questions. But the question is this research? And the question is it generalizable? I would argue no, because the data is only valid for the sample of students in that department and what their curriculum is. It's not generalizable to other departments unless there are some controls and some cooperation between multiple departments across universities. So just trying to figure out whether our students are learning what we're teaching them by itself is not research. Even if it looks systematic, it might look like research, but I don't really think it's research because the results are not generalizable to other institutions. Evaluation of a new discharge plan on a hospital unit. Depends on the discharge plan, but oftentimes these are validated already, and all that's happening is the particular unit is evaluating whether their implementation of that discharge plan is effective. And so this is effectively QI, quality improvement work, and is probably not generalizable. If it was a new discharge plan that somebody had made up and they were maybe pilot testing it on a particular unit, that might be generalizable, although they may not have a large enough N. But certainly if they tried it out then at multiple institutions, that now we're starting to look at something, starting to look like something that's generalizable. Student evaluations of teaching, again, this is very similar to the assessment case above. These are valid only for that particular class, that particular faculty member, those particular students. You can't really draw any conclusions from that data that would be generalizable to other teachers. It depends. Now there are some national evaluation forms, the IDEA form, the CIEQ, I think. These have been validated nationally, and that data may be generalizable because they've been validated, although you would have to have certainly more data than just the evaluations to draw some more generalizable conclusions. So it's clear, certainly in these last two examples, that what's generalizable depends upon the circumstances, the context in which the activity takes place. Usually if it's a very local context, it may not be generalizable, but it may also be just the methods are not generalizable. A case study of a patient submitted for publication. This is quite common in certain medical disciplines. This is not generalizable. The thinking about it, the thought process might be generalizable, but the results are not necessarily generalizable. And it's certainly not a large enough N to draw any conclusions. An investigation by the student newspaper, a student cheating on campus. Again, they might use research methods. They might do a survey. They might go out and interview people. They might look very systematic. We have to be very careful with the First Amendment and newspapers in particular. They operate under a different set of rules than the rest of us because they are news organizations. In general, my definition of generalizable is the following. If the results of the study would change or could possibly change the practices of other practitioners in that area, then I think it's generalizable, right? If what is generalizable are the methods of the study, that is, we, in this case, use these rubrics, we had the students do this kind of work, they were learning this kind of thing, that probably is not generalizable in the sense that it would change the practices of others by saying this pedagogical method is better than that pedagogical method, right? Whereas if we were to compare two different classroom experiences and do that across a number of different classes in different institutions, now there's something that we might be generalizable, and we might be able to say, having students rewrite papers is actually more effective than having them write multiple new papers without rewriting, something like that, right? So I think it has to do with the results of the study and whether the results can be generalized. All right, definition of human subjects. The new regs clarified this a little bit, I think, in a good way. Human subject means a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research obtains information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction, and uses, studies, or analyzes the information. Obtains, uses, studies, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. Intervention includes both physical procedures by which information or biospecimens are gathered and manipulations of the subject or their environment. Interaction includes communication or interpersonal contact between investigator and subject. Private information includes information about behavior that occurs in a context in which an individual can reasonably expect that no observation or recording is taking place. And this is probably the most important part of the definition here, or at least in my view. And the information has been provided for specific purposes by an individual that they can reasonably expect will not be made public. For instance, a medical record. You might think, for instance, your credit card transactions are private information. Good luck with that. As you can see, what's private and what, the way our our society has manipulated our information ecosystem somewhat problematic. Identifiable private information, I think you're all familiar with this. The identity can be ascertained by the investigator and or is linked to the information. So, is review of medical records with names and IDs redacted, is that a human subject? My answer is probably going to be yes, it is, because I don't think that if you just remove names and IDs that you have removed enough identifiers. If you look at the list of 18 HIPAA identifiers, those include address information, zip code, all sorts of other identifiers. One of the curious things about data that is stored in a database is if you give me somebody's medical record with 20 data points, I could probably figure out who that patient is just by running a query for those 20 data points because that's probably going to be a fairly unique set of data. It doesn't take much in the way of data points to be able to identify somebody if you have access to the database in this case. And of course, that's one of the issues that the regulations were trying to address, the new regulations. Reading identified student papers, is it a human subject? It may not be research, but it certainly would count as a student subject, right? It's identifiable private information. Students don't expect their papers to be, out there in public unless they've explicitly, decided to publish them. Genetic analyses of anonymous tissue samples. Our hope is that they are anonymous, but as many of you know, the genome is a unique identifier. And so it is possible to take a very little bit of genetic information, and if it exists in a database someplace, match it up and you can identify the person. There have been some studies doing that publicly, and you can, with not too much genetic information, identify somebody. So this problem will remain with us. The new regs, as we'll see, do try to address this issue in terms of what limited IRB review means. We'll get to that hopefully. Analysis of videotapes pulled from security cameras in a campus center. It could be a public library. It could be the DMV. It doesn't really matter where it is. This would not constitute human subjects research because it's public. It's a public area. There's no expectation of privacy in the DMV or the campus center. So it's really not human subjects. And by now, we probably all expect it to be on video under some, at least in most circumstances in public. Anonymous survey about drug and alcohol use. This is still a human subject, although it's not private identifiable information, but the survey is an intervention or an interaction. It's an interaction actually with the subject. So it's still a human subject. It may not be identifiable and it may be exempt, but we're still intervening or interacting with a human subject. All right, I'm going to switch gears here, talk a little bit about informed consent. And my favorite moral principle, respect for persons. This is from the Belmont report. It notes that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents and that persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. And it goes on to say to respect autonomy, they actually give us at least some definition of autonomy here, is to give weight to autonomous persons' considered opinions and choices, while refraining from obstructing their actions unless they are clearly detrimental to others. The most important part of this definition is in the dependent clause, which is unusual, but it's the while refraining from obstructing their actions unless they are clearly detrimental to others. This is the origin of the concept of consent, or let me put it this way. This is the ethical foundation, the moral foundation for the concept of consent, right? To respect autonomy, yeah, we will consider what it is that you want to do, but what we actually have to do to respect autonomy is not interfere with you. So this is really a principle of non-interference. It is a negative principle in that it tells us what not to do. It tells us not to obstruct others in their actions, right? Period, end of story. The only disclaimer on that is if you're setting out to hurt somebody and your action is clearly going to be harmful to somebody else, maybe we will override, we'll violate your autonomy, we will prevent you from doing that. But otherwise, if you want to make a choice, it's up to you to carry that choice out. We don't have to help you, but we may not hinder you in that choice. And so consent means giving permission, right? And so anytime there's a consent process, it means that the individual may refuse to participate in whatever it is that you are offering them. In the doctor-patient relationship, what this means is that the patient may refuse the treatment, even at risk of their own life, right? Some very famous medical ethics cases involve exactly that question. If you're familiar with the Dax Cowart case, really interesting case, somebody trying to refuse burn treatment and was denied, was forced to undergo burn treatment for a number of months. It's a very interesting story if you get a chance to check it out. But this is the origin of consent. Obviously, in order to have informed consent, you have to have, or to make a good choice about whether to be treated or not, to participate in a study or not, you need to be informed. You need to have knowledge about what's going on. You need to know what your options are, what the consequences, etc. And hence we get informed consent from this definition. But note that respect for autonomy doesn't mean we have to do whatever it is you want to do, right? Doctors are obligated to help their patients in what they think is medically appropriate care, but they're not obligated to do anything the patient asks, right? And their obligation to help the patient comes from beneficence, their duty to do good, to act in the best interests of their patients. All this principle says is before you do anything, you got to have consent, assuming that the patient is competent. Excuse me. All right, so we have now the idea of waiver of informed consent. So having sort of harped on the necessity of asking permission, and that's the Belmont report, and that's the origin of informed consent in the Belmont report, the regulations turn around and say, hey, you don't always have to do informed consent. And I want to look at what that means. So these are the criteria for waiver of informed consent. I think these are the old regs. I think there's an additional option that's not relevant to the discussion here in the new regs. So I apologize for that. I didn't update these particular ones from the new regs. But there's 4 criteria basically you got to meet. First of all, it has to be minimal risk research. Secondly, the waiver or alteration will not adversely affect the rights and welfare of the subjects. In all the years I've entertained waivers of informed consent, I've never seen a protocol actually address that criteria other than to say, no, this doesn't adversely affect the rights and welfare of the patients. The curious thing about this is that the purpose of the regulations is to protect the rights and welfare of subjects. And one of the ways that we do that is by informed consent. And then we turn around and we say, well, you don't have to do consent. So you don't have to do the thing that's going to protect the rights and welfare. So it's kind of circular. It's very, very curious. And I've never seen a case where somebody could actually sort of articulate that, the waiver was somehow not adversely affecting the rights and welfare. It's kind of bizarre. It's minimal risk to begin with, so that's already taken care of. So welfare is not the issue. So I think most of us, and maybe you have some ideas about this, but most of us kind of ignore that one, and unless something really glaring showed up. This is the one in red that's really important. This is the one that we actually have to sort of document. Research could not practically be carried out without the waiver or alteration, right? So the PI has to demonstrate to the IRB that there's no way to do this study without waiving consent or altering consent, right? The alteration of consent is most typical with deception research, a lot of psychology research. You just can't do it without deceiving your subjects, right? And for that reason, when appropriate, the subjects will be provided with additional information. That's the debriefing thing. And we have that thanks to Stanley Milgram, who did a psychology experiment that caused a great deal of psychological duress to its subjects. So again, I recommend reading about Stanley Milgram. But a full waiver of informed consent, it's sort of interesting because it would seem that we're failing to respect autonomy by making that waiver. And so what the regulations are saying is, if the research can't otherwise be carried out and we're not putting the subjects at risk, then it may be appropriate to waive consent. They just have to demonstrate that getting consent would not be practical. So what the regulations are doing are balancing respect for persons, autonomy, versus the benefits of research. And when the risks are minimal, informed consent is not an absolute obligation, right? So the typical cases for waiver of informed consent, if you want to collect identifiable medical records prospectively, and link those records up to other data sets that you have so that you can do some interesting data analysis. It may not be possible to get consent from the next 10,000 patients in your institution, for instance, right? So the sheer numbers may make it impossible to get consent. Now, we do have this concept of broad consent, which is one of the ways that the new regs are attempting to address that problem of just completely overriding, just not even asking folks, right? Is by asking them in a broad way, can we use your data for research? Likewise with, tissues research, investigation of biospecimens and so forth. Those are typical cases for waiver of informed consent. There are some others. I worry that the broad consent rules and the concern about consent in these cases is stepping on the goose that's laying the golden egg, because there's an enormous amount of value in biospecimens, genetic information, medical records. We are all the beneficiaries of that information. And I think in some ways we have an obligation to contribute to that. And I don't see this I see the waiver of informed consent as a way to continue to produce that good knowledge at very little or no cost to the individual. So that's kind of where I fall, and that's certainly where the regulations fell. That informed consent is not an absolute. It's weighed against other benefits and harms. There is a waiver of documentation of informed consent. I'm going to skip over that, but it is a little used and very useful little piece of the regs. When you can do it, I always recommend waiving documentation of informed consent. At this point, I was going to go through the exemption categories, but I see that it is 3:55 my time. So I am going to stop here. I'm going to skip down through these and just end with this last question. Who sets IRB policy? The regulations don't tell us that, but my recommendation is the IRB should not set its own policy. It should be involved in setting policy, but left to our own devices, we will tend towards mission creep. We will start, reviewing science when it's not appropriate and imposing our moral judgments about the value of the research, et cetera, et cetera. Anything that goes beyond the regulations, I think, should be set by the institution, the faculty, the administration, the staff, whatever kind of institution it is, through normal governance procedures. To make sure that everybody is on board when we are when the IRB is charged to do things that are beyond the regulations. The institution's role is to set policy, can't overturn IRB denial, but can deny permission for IRB-approved protocols, and I've seen that happen, much to my chagrin. So a couple of resources here. I think you're probably all familiar with them. So I appreciate your time today. If any of you have questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. You can, on the GoToMeeting console, raise your hand, and I will open up your mic, or you will find a questions panel on the GoToMeeting console, and you could type in a question. So if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand, and I will try to recognize you, or type it in. I see James has a question, so I'm going to open your mic. James, are you there?
I'm here.
Hey, yeah, good. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
All right. So what's your question?
So this case of waiver of consent is actually at issue with the protocol I'm just looking at today. Only it's waiver of parental consent, which comes up a lot in educational settings. So the researcher wants to do research. It is minimal risk, so it's not huge, and she wants to use an opt-out procedure. So that's a modification of informed consent, where they send home the information sheet, which is virtually identical to a consent form, and parents, in theory, have the opportunity to say no. They don't want their student to be involved in the research. What's your take on those? Because I've got mixed views. Usually it's that impracticable one that they want to invoke.
Right. And if I recall, and I'm going by memory here, I could pull up the regs, but it might take a minute. I don't think opt-out is legitimate under the subpart for children, but I would have to go and check that for sure. But I would look at the subpart on children and what the how the waiver applies for children. I think it does specify that. The easy way around this is if it is exempt research, then and it's educational research, there is no requirement for parental consent in the category 1 exemption category.
Yeah.
So
it doesn't qualify for one.
That's too bad, because that's the best way to do this job, to get around that problem. I do know I've worked with some IRBs that routinely will grant waiver parental, to allow the opt-out. And I've also seen school systems or specific schools that have a policy of opt-out by the parents. And so, the IRB, stands there and says, well, no, you can't do that. And the school system says, no, that's the way we do things here. And so you're sort of stuck. I think, practically speaking, and again, going back to the prime directive here of, protecting human subjects, is not allowing a parental opt-out going to result in greater protection of children or parents, right? Chance. I mean, if the answer is no, that the parents or the children could possibly be harmed as a result, then I'd say no, we can't do the opt-out. But I think in many cases, this is social science research. We're testing out a new curriculum, we're doing some sort of survey sort of thing, right? There's good knowledge to be had, but we know that we're not going to get valid knowledge. It would be impractical because we know that the response rate for parents is exceedingly low, particularly in specific schools and demographics, right? So that's a problem.
Right. So here's my and I don't want to delay you too much. If there are other questions, I'll talk to you offline.
Sure, go ahead. I mean, I don't see any questions yet, so everybody's listening with keen ears, I guess.
So, invoking the fourth, I think it's the fourth criterion, that it would be impracticable to carry out the research otherwise. In this case, based on the fact that there's a low response rate from parents, isn't that the same as saying, well, doesn't that also entail that parents are not likely to ever see the form, right? The idea is that it's hard to get students to take forms home.
I think that works. I mean, I think it is impractical when, particularly, when the school has that policy, Or when we know that the parent's response rate is going to be very low.
Right. But I guess what I'm saying is it seems like it's a two-edged sword. That, in one sense, is a justification for granting a waiver or an alteration in this case. They're not asking for waivers.
Right.
But at the same time, that's saying that parents are not likely to see what the altered informed consent.
Right, right. I mean, that's
so what's the point of doing it at all?
If they're unlikely to see it at all, right?
Yeah.
Right, because
so
they
if
send
the
it home to
alteration means no informed consent, then
yeah, right. So I think that's a good point. I will have to look and see if I can find where I thought there was a place in subpart. I think it's D for children that ruled this out. But I seem to recall that it is ruled out. But I just don't have at the tip of my fingers the regulatory language, and I can't find it while I'm talking. So
okay, I'll take another look. But I think it doesn't get ruled out, but I'll take another look myself.
If you can do it, then I mean, if it's not ruled out, then you can do it, and you can grant the waiver of or the modification of parental consent.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question. Nice to talk to you. We missed you at Primer.
Yeah, I missed you too.
Yeah.
Missed Primer.
All right. Any other questions? Anybody else have a question or unable to find the raise your hand button? James, where was the raise your hand button?
It's there's a little slide out, or I guess it's a slide. Yeah, there's a little slide out on the control panel. Okay. Same little bar where you can mute or unmute yourself.
Okay. All right. Well, if anybody else has a question, please feel free. All right. Well, hearing no further questions, thank you very much. We did record this today, so Paul will post that recording and he'll send you a link to it. I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. And if you have any questions for me, if you'd like to email them to me, you've got my email address here. If you want to harangue me for my outrageous statements today, feel free to do so. I'd love to engage with you. So thank you very much and have a good day.